Look at that barn, it's falling apart. And these chickens running wild. That truck is a disgrace. This whole place is a mess.
This is the story of what happened when a woman in a navy blue blazer and beige heels drove up to an 80-acre farm in Monroe County, Tennessee, rolled down her car window with the kind of certainty that only comes from somebody who's never been told no, and told a 72-year-old man with dried mud caked on his work boots that his entire life, his farm, his barn, his animals, his 90 years of family history, was an embarrassment to the neighborhood and needed to be fixed immediately, or there would be consequences. And her name was Deborah Finch. And that was her first mistake, because she didn't understand that some men are quiet, not because they're weak, but because they're holding back a kind of patience that can last for decades, and she'd just woken that patience up. Now, the thing about Earl Calloway is that he was the kind of quiet man who'd been up since 4 o'clock in the morning every single day for the last 53 years, without complaint, without exception, without even thinking about it much anymore. It was just what he did. The sun hadn't even started thinking about coming up when Earl was already out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold wood floor of the farmhouse, his mind already moving through the day ahead like water moving downhill. He didn't rush through anything. He didn't make quick decisions. He moved through his days with the same patient, unhurried rhythm that his grandfather had taught him, and his grandfather had learned from his father before that. A rhythm that went back through generations of Callaways who understood that good work isn't something you do fast, it's something you do right. At 72 years old, Earl had a weathered face lined like a detailed map of Monroe County, fine lines around his eyes from squinting at weather, deeper lines around his mouth from 50 years of quiet thinking, and a kind of lean strength in his frame that the years had never managed to bend. He had silver stubble on his chin that he shaved about 3 times a week with a straight razor in the bathroom, and his faded green John Deere cap sat on his head most days, with a logo so worn you could barely see it anymore. Just the ghost of green stitching on faded fabric. He wore denim overalls over a plain white t-shirt, and those overalls had been washed so many times by Mabel that they'd taken on a soft, weathered color that only comes from decades of use and care. His scuffed brown leather work boots were caked with dried mud from the morning's work in the barn, and those boots had walked every single inch of those 80 acres that his family had owned since 1937, when a man named Virgil Calloway came down from Kentucky with nothing but a clear voice, a strong back, and an idea about what could be built in this red clay county if a man was willing to work hard enough. Earl's wife, Mabel, had been listening to him think without speaking for 47 years, and she'd learned that silence, in Earl's case, was a kind of language all its own. She knew every flavor of his quiet, the quiet of contentment when he was working the land, the quiet of concentration when something needed fixing, the quiet of sadness when another old friend passed away, and the quiet of worry when something pressed on his mind. She could tell by the way he sat down in the kitchen chair in the morning whether he'd slept well or spent half the night thinking about something. She could tell by how he drank his coffee whether the day ahead felt good or uncertain. She worried about him the way wives worry after that many years together, always paying attention to the small things, the soft sounds he made, the way he sat on the porch swing in the evening, the way he stared at his weathered hands as if they might tell him something about what was coming next. Mabel was 70 years old herself, with white hair that she kept pinned back, and a face that had smiled a lot more than it had frowned. She wore simple dresses and sensible shoes, and she moved through their farmhouse with a kind of quiet purpose that matched Earl's own pace. She hummed hymns in the kitchen while she worked, songs that had been taught to her by her grandmother and had stuck with her all these years. And she could remember every hymn by heart, every verse, every harmony. She made biscuits the way she'd been making them for more than half a century, using her mother's recipe, her hands knowing exactly how much flour, how much buttermilk, how much butter, without even needing to measure anymore. When something worried her, her hymn humming got quieter and more serious, the melodies taking on a minor key, and anybody who knew her could tell by the tone of her humming whether the world felt right or whether something was wrong. The 80 acres where Earl lived and worked had belonged to his family for generations now, going back nearly 100 years to a time when this county was wilder and there were fewer people and nobody had ever heard the word subdivision. That farmland had been cleared by hand in the 1930s by Virgil Calloway, who'd arrived in Monroe County with almost nothing and an absolute determination to build something that would last. Virgil had worked with nothing but a mule, an axe, a shovel, and his own 2 hands for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, clearing trees and rocks and brush until he had 80 acres of land suitable for farming. And in the process of clearing that land, in the process of making it usable, Virgil had done something that would matter more than any of them could have possibly known in those hard, hungry Depression years. He had built a road. This wasn't a highway, and it wasn't a county road maintained by the government. This was a private gravel road that Virgil had built himself, and he'd built it to connect his farm to the county highway about 3 miles down the way, so that he'd have access to markets and to town. The road wound through the trees, and it took you past the main house and the barn and all the working parts of the farm, and it was the only way in and the only way out for anyone coming from that direction. When Virgil was done building the road, when he'd packed the gravel and established the drainage and made sure it would hold up to Monroe County weather, he'd done something that showed he understood property and legacy. He'd deeded the road to himself and his heirs forever. Callaway Road, it was marked on the county maps, a private road owned and maintained by the Callaway family, the only road in and the only road out for anyone who wanted to come through that way. For nearly 100 years, that road had belonged to the Callaways, and it had been maintained by the Callaways, and nobody had ever questioned it because everybody understood a simple fact. If it was yours, you took care of it, and if you took care of it, it stayed yours. Earl had spent his life maintaining Callaway Road, patching gravel, fixing drainage, keeping it passable in winter, making sure it stayed the kind of road that wouldn't cause trouble for anybody who used it to get to the highway. But 5 years before Deborah Finch showed up at his gate, something changed in Monroe County. A developer came through, a man with money and vision and the kind of confidence that comes from having succeeded in Nashville, and he saw that farmland just beyond the Callaway property. It wasn't the Callaways' land, it was land that had belonged to someone else. And he got an idea about subdivision homes. He could see it clearly, he thought. Neat rows of houses, all of them similar enough to feel safe. All of them with little front yards and attached garages and the kind of neighborhood amenities that Nashville people wanted when they moved out to the country to escape the city. He bought the land, he got his permits. He built Meadow Creek Estates, 43 homes arranged in neat streets with neighborhood-appropriate mailboxes, carefully maintained sidewalks, well-lit street lamps, and a community center with a pool. All of them were accessed by a single road that led into the development and then back out to civilization. That road was Callaway Road. Now, the developer knew about Callaway Road. The contractors who built the homes knew about it. The real estate agents who sold the homes to people moving from Nashville knew about it. They all knew that every single person who lived in Meadow Creek Estates was going to have to drive on Callaway Road every time they wanted to go to work or school or to the grocery store. But what they didn't spend much time thinking about, what they didn't investigate, what they apparently didn't consider important enough to research in courthouse records, was the question of who actually owned Callaway Road, and what would happen if the person who owned it ever decided to care. For 4 years, nothing happened. Earl lived his life the same way he'd always lived it. He got up before dawn, and he moved quietly through the farmhouse so as not to wake Mabel before it was time, and he went to the kitchen and lit the stove and put a pot of coffee on the burner. He waited for it to get strong, really strong, the way he liked it, bitter and thick and dark enough to be almost black. He drank that coffee standing at the kitchen counter, and he let it warm him from the inside, and he thought about the day ahead. Then he walked out to the barn and handled his animals with the same gentleness and respect that his father had taught him, and his grandfather had taught his father. He worked the land, and when something needed fixing, he fixed it. He mended the fence when it broke. He sat on his porch and watched the weather move across Monroe County, and he didn't think much about the subdivision that had been built on the road he owned. The subdivision didn't think much about him either. They came and went on Callaway Road. Their children played in their little yards. Their houses got painted the right colors. The community center was used for HOA meetings and block parties and all the things that people do when they're trying to create a sense of community in a place where there isn't one yet. Life in Meadow Creek Estates moved along smoothly, the way it was supposed to. Then, 4 years after the subdivision opened, 2 years after Earl had started noticing more cars coming and going, Deborah Finch moved into a house at the entrance to the neighborhood. She bought a 2-story colonial with a 3-car garage and a manicured lawn, and she unpacked her belongings and decided that she was going to make Meadow Creek Estates into something special. She was in her late 50s, with shoulder-length blonde hair that looked like it had been professionally styled twice a week without fail. Hair that was the same color every time you saw her. She had the kind of posture and confidence that comes from climbing some kind of corporate ladder for 30 years in Nashville. And she'd apparently learned at that corporate ladder that life was meant to be organized and managed and improved. That disorder was a personal failing, and that the right person with the right clipboard could fix almost anything. She wore a navy blue blazer even on days that were too warm for it, and she wore it like it was a uniform that made her an authority. She had beige heels that clicked on pavement and on hardwood floors, and she had a leather clipboard folder that she carried everywhere like it was proof of her right to be in charge. She had a car that was always clean, and a calendar that was always full, and an answer for every problem that she hadn't even had time to understand yet. 2 years after moving to Meadow Creek Estates, after watching the neighborhood carefully and deciding exactly what needed to change, Deborah Finch volunteered to be the president of the HOA. The HOA before, that had been a casual thing, just neighbors getting together to make sure nobody painted their house a wild color and the common areas didn't fall apart. But Deborah Finch had bigger ideas about what an HOA president could be. She called for elections, she ran, she won. And suddenly, the HOA had a president with a vision. The first time Deborah Finch drove past Earl's farm in her capacity as HOA president, something shifted in her face like a light turning on in a dark room. She was driving home from some kind of meeting, probably, her hands on the steering wheel of her white sedan, her mind on her clipboard and her plans for the neighborhood, and then she came around the bend on Callaway Road where the trees opened up, and she saw Earl's farm spread out in front of her, and she didn't see what she was supposed to see. Earl's farm didn't look like the other farms in Monroe County, because Earl's farm looked like a working farm, not like a photograph from a magazine or a concept that a designer had thought up in an office in Nashville. There was a barn that had been there since the 1970s, weathered gray, worn by decades of Tennessee weather and honest work. Around that barn were tools and machinery, a John Deere tractor, a hay baler, various pieces of equipment that need to be nearby when you're doing actual farm work. There was a pickup truck, a Ford with more than 100,000 miles on it, parked where Earl could get to it quick if he needed it for work. The truck bed showed signs of actual use. There was a woodpile the size of a shed, because Monroe County winters aren't gentle, and a man with sense prepares for them. There were chickens in a pen. There were the fences that Earl maintained himself, because that's what you do when land is yours and you care for it. There was the screen porch where he and Mabel sat most evenings, and there was the kind of life being lived that you can actually see when you look at a property, the way a working place looks different from a decorated place. Something in Deborah Finch couldn't accept that. Maybe she looked at that working farm and saw something that frightened her, some reminder that control is always an illusion, that things don't stay neat, that life is always messier than a clipboard and a vision can account for. Maybe she just decided that this was her opportunity to prove that she could make a difference. Whatever it was, she made a decision. She was going to fix it. And that was her first big mistake. She showed up at Earl's property on a Tuesday morning in May, early enough that Mabel was still at the stove, and Earl had just come back from the barn with his hands dirty and his mind on the day's work. Deborah pulled up in her white sedan with a Meadow Creek Estates president placard on the dashboard, and she got out of the car with a kind of confidence that only comes when you haven't yet met resistance, and she walked to the porch where Earl was wiping his hands on an old rag that had once been a work shirt. "You need to do something about your property," she said. She didn't say hello. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't offer her hand. She just said it like it was a fact that everybody should have already agreed on, like it was obvious. Earl looked at her the way you look at something that doesn't quite make sense at first, like you're waiting for the picture to come into focus. He set down the rag he was holding, and he wiped the rest of the moisture off on his overalls. "Ma'am," he said. "Your farm is an eyesore," Deborah said. She had a kind of clipped way of speaking, like she was reading off a list. The barn, the truck, the chickens, the woodpile, all of it. It's bringing down property values in the subdivision. I'm the president of the Meadow Creek Estates HOA, and I'm telling you that you need to clean this up, or we're going to have to take action. The HOA has bylaws about community aesthetics, and your property is in violation of every single one of them. And here's where it gets important. Because Earl didn't get defensive, He didn't tell her that this was his property and his life and the life's work of his family for 90 years. He didn't mention that his farm had been there long before her subdivision was even a thought in some developer's mind. He didn't point out that everything on his property was there because it was necessary to the actual work of farming, and that farms, by definition, don't look like subdivision lawns. He just nodded in that way he had, in that way that made people feel like maybe he understood something important, and he said very quietly, "Ma'am, I appreciate you taking the time to come out here and share your thoughts, but this is my farm, and I take care of it the way I see fit." Deborah Finch's face tightened, her jaw clenched. She wasn't used to being declined. "Well, you don't see fit very well," she said. "You have until the end of the month to make improvements to your property, or the HOA is going to start issuing formal violation notices. And if you don't comply after that, we're going to start imposing fines. Do you understand me?" Earl looked at her the same way he'd been looking at her the whole time. Calm, patient, not angry. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I understand what you're saying." "Good," Deborah said. "I expect to see improvements." And then she turned and walked back to her white sedan, and she got in, and she started the engine, and she pulled out of Earl's driveway, leaving dust hanging in the air. Earl stood there on the porch, watching her go, not saying anything, just watching her drive away down Callaway Road toward the subdivision. Mabel came to the door then, wiping her hands on her apron, and she asked Earl what that was about, and Earl said, "Neighborly advice," and Mabel knew he was lying, which meant she knew something was wrong, which meant she started worrying in a way that made her hymn humming shift from cheerful melodies to something darker and more complicated. The violation notice came on a Monday morning, delivered to the mailbox at the edge of Earl's property. Earl brought it inside and sat down at the kitchen table, where the morning light was streaming through the window, and he opened it and he read it while his coffee got cold. The letter was formal and official. It had the Meadow Creek Estates HOA letterhead at the top, and it was printed on cream-colored paper, and it had a date and a long list of violations. The letter said that the Callaway property was not consistent with community aesthetic standards. It listed specific violations: abandoned farming equipment, excessive livestock, improper building maintenance, visual clutter, and failure to maintain property in accordance with HOA community design guidelines. It said that compliance was required within 10 days, or a fine of $200 per week would commence, and it was signed by Deborah Finch as HOA president. Earl read it sitting at the kitchen table, with Mabel watching him from across the table, her hands busy with something she was preparing for dinner, but her eyes on his face. And when he was done reading, he folded the letter carefully, creasing it along the same lines it had been creased when it came, and he set it aside. He didn't call a lawyer, he didn't get angry, he didn't raise his voice. He just set the letter aside and pushed his cold coffee away and said, "Well," and Mabel said, "What is it?" And he said, "HOA violation. They want me to fix something about how the farm looks." And Mabel's hymn humming that evening got even quieter. The next week, another notice came. This one was more serious. It was from a law office in Nashville, the office of the HOA's attorney, a man named Richard Thornton, who apparently specialized in HOA enforcement. The letter was heavier paper, and it was more legalistic, and it talked about liens and legal action and the enforcement mechanisms of the HOA bylaws. It said that unless Earl brought his property into compliance immediately, the HOA would be forced to pursue legal remedies to protect the interests of its members. The letter was longer and more detailed, and included copies of the HOA bylaws and specific sections that Earl's property was supposedly violating. And then, to make sure everybody understood how serious this was, Deborah Finch made a photocopy of the legal letter, and she had it laminated, and she taped it to a post at the edge of Earl's property, where everyone coming in and out of the subdivision would see it. She wanted to make sure that anyone driving on Callaway Road understood that Earl Callaway was in violation of community standards, and that action was being taken. That was when things started to change in the county. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, because this story is proof that you should never underestimate a quiet man on his own land. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the HOA Trap. People started talking, not in an ugly way, but in the way that people talk about things they don't quite understand and are trying to make sense of. The diner in town, Robertson's Diner, had an extra buzz in the early mornings. Men who came in for coffee would sit in the booths and say things like, "What's going on with Earl Calloway? Is he having some kind of trouble with those subdivision people?" And the waitress would say, "I heard they're suing him." And someone else would say, "Can they do that? It's his farm." People who'd known Earl his whole life started calling him to check on him, just to make sure he was all right. His son called from Memphis, where he worked in construction. His daughter called from Knoxville, where she taught school. They asked him if he wanted to hire a lawyer, and he said, "Not yet," which is the kind of thing Earl says when he's already thinking several moves ahead, but he's not ready to tell you what he's thinking yet. The fines started coming at the end of the 10 days. $200 the first week, another $200 the second week, a third notice at the end of the third week. Earl didn't pay them. He didn't call Deborah Finch or the lawyer or the HOA board. He didn't attend any meetings. He didn't respond to any of their letters, but he didn't ignore them either. He took each one as it came, and he put it in a folder in a drawer by the kitchen table, and Mabel watched him do it every time, filing them away. And that was when her worrying got serious, when she started praying in a different register, when her hymn humming became quiet enough that Earl could barely hear it, even when he was sitting in the kitchen. She made more biscuits. She began to worry in the way a woman worries when she can see her husband carrying something heavy and she can't quite figure out what to do to help him set it down. One evening, about 3 weeks into the fines, after Earl had gotten the 8th or 9th notice, Deborah Finch had the HOA lawyer send a letter promising liens against the property if the fines weren't paid. Earl received it, read it, and added it to the folder. That evening, when Mabel was inside making dinner, Earl sat on the porch swing after the sun had gone down, and he sat there alone. And he was rereading the letters from the HOA's lawyer and the violation notices and all the documentation of what Deborah Finch and her HOA board wanted him to do. The crickets were loud in that Monroe County way they get in early summer, and the light was fading out of the sky, and you could see something in his face that hadn't been there before. It was exhaustion, not the tiredness of physical work. He'd been tired from work every day of his life since he was a boy, and he was used to it, and the physical tiredness never bothered him much. But this was different. This was the tiredness of carrying something that nobody else could see yet, something that nobody else could help him with. He was 72 years old, and he'd spent his whole life on that land, and his father had spent his whole life on that land, and his grandfather before him. And now, some woman with beige heels and a clipboard had decided that his life's work didn't meet her standards, that the way his family had done things for 4 generations was wrong. It bothered him. He was too honest to pretend that it didn't. If this story's got you hooked, share it and subscribe to the HOA Trap, because what this old man does next is why you never mess with a farmer on his own land. The next morning, Earl got up before dawn the way he always did. He made coffee. He didn't tell Mabel what he was going to do, but he put on his best jeans, the ones without grease stains from the barn work. And he combed his hair with his hand, and he went to the closet and got his second best shirt, the one he usually wore to church. He got in the truck and drove to the county courthouse in the county seat, about 30 minutes away. The courthouse was a brick building that had been standing there since 1924, built solid and meant to last. And inside of it, in the basement, in a vault that's kept at a specific temperature and humidity to preserve the documents, they kept the deeds. They keep all the property records there, and they go back as far as the county has existed. And somewhere in that vault was the original deed to Earl's property, and the deed to Calloway Road. Herschel Webb had been the county clerk for 32 years, and he'd retired 10 years ago. But he still came to the courthouse basement to volunteer and to help people navigate the deed records. It was the kind of work he loved, working with documents and history and the way property tells the story of a place and people. When Earl walked in, Herschel was sitting at one of the wooden tables in the basement, helping a woman find something about her grandmother's property, trying to trace the title back a few generations. Herschel looked up when he heard Earl's footsteps, and he recognized him immediately. They'd known each other for 50 years, having grown up in Monroe County at the same time, going to the same schools, marrying around the same time, raising families at the same time. "Earl Calloway," Herschel said, and he stood up and extended his hand. "What brings you down here to the basement?" "Herschel," Earl said, and he shook the man's hand with the kind of grip that comes from a lifetime of real work. He nodded the way men do when they've known each other for 50 years, and they don't need to waste time with unnecessary greeting. "I need to find the deed on my property, going back as far as I can. The original deed if it's here. Original deed to Calloway Road, specifically." Herschel's eyes moved something. Just a little flicker, a small shift in the way he was looking at Earl. It was quick, and it was subtle, but it was enough. Herschel knew Earl. He knew that Earl Calloway didn't come to the courthouse vault to look at deeds unless something was wrong. He knew that Earl was a man who'd been satisfied with his property for his whole life, who didn't question deeds, who just worked his land. If Earl was suddenly interested in the original deed, something had changed, but Herschel didn't ask. He'd learned a long time ago that people tell you what you need to know if you give them time to do it. Instead, he just nodded and said, "Follow me." And he walked Earl back to the records, back to the oldest documents, and he pulled the original deed. Earl sat down at the wooden table and began to read. The deed was dated March 15th, 1937. It was written in that formal script they used back then, with letters that had been carefully penned by someone who understood the weight of property and permanence. The deed transferred 80 acres in Monroe County to Virgil Calloway and his heirs and assigns forever. Those were the words it used, forever, because when you deed property, you're making a promise that stretches into the future, beyond your own life. But more than just the land, more important even than the land itself, the deed also specifically transferred the gravel road. Calloway Road was named by name in the deed. It was described as a private road, built by the grantor, Virgil, on the property, and it was transferred as part of the property, as part of the legacy that Virgil Calloway was giving to his family. It was his, not just the farm, the road, the only road in, the only road out. Herschel sat down across from Earl and waited for him to finish reading. "That subdivision," Herschel said finally, "the Meadow Creek Estates place. They know about this? They know the road is yours?" "Don't think they care much," Earl said. "Or maybe they don't know. Probably don't know." "They should care," Herschel said. He leaned forward. "The whole thing depends on that road. Everything about that subdivision is built on something that belongs to you. If it's your road, Earl, it's your road. Nobody can use it without your permission. You understand what I'm saying?" Earl understood. He understood very well. He could see the chessboard now, and he could see all the pieces moving. He could see Deborah Finch and her HOA board, all dependent on a road they didn't own, threatening to sue him for what was on his own property. He could see the way this was going to go if he played it right. He could see all of it, clear as day. He made a photocopy of the deed. He had Herschel sign a document verifying exactly what he'd found, making it official and notarized. And then he drove to the office of a lawyer in the county, not a fancy one, not someone from Nashville, just a man named Bill Patterson who'd been handling wills and property disputes and land cases for 40 years in Monroe County. Bill was someone who understood the county, understood its people, understood the way things worked and didn't work in a place like this. Bill Patterson looked at the deed, and he looked at the photocopy, and he looked at the records that Herschel had signed, and he let out a long, slow whistle. "Earl," he said, "you're sitting on something here, something real. This subdivision is entirely dependent on your road for access, and they built it without ever confirming who owned the road. That's a major problem for them. That's a very major problem." "I don't want to hurt anybody," Earl said. "I just want them to leave me be. I want to work my farm without being harassed about what it looks like. I want them to understand that they can't treat me like I'm somebody they can bully." "Understood," Bill said. "I can send them a letter. It'll be professional. It'll be clear and direct. It won't be a threat, but it'll be clear about what you own and what the legal situation is. It won't be mean, but it will make sure they understand what's at stake." "That's fine," Earl said. "Do it." Bill Patterson sent the letter on a Friday afternoon. It was addressed to the Meadow Creek Estates HOA, and it was sent by certified mail, return receipt requested, so there would be a record of them receiving it. The letter explained in very clear language and with references to the original deed and the county records that Calloway Road was private property. It said the road had been deeded to the Calloway family in 1937, that it had been continuously owned and maintained by the Calloway family for nearly 90 years, and that the HOA subdivision had been built and developed with complete dependence on this private road. The letter said that any further harassment of the property owner regarding his private property would result in the property owner exercising his rights as the owner of the private road to restrict access. It was professional, it was calm, it was careful, but it was also, in its quiet way, absolutely terrifying for anyone who understood what it meant. It was saying, without actually saying it, that Earl Calloway could close the road, that Earl Calloway could block every single resident of Meadow Creek Estates from accessing the outside world. And the more Deborah Finch and the HOA board thought about that, the more they understood exactly how much trouble they were in. If you're watching the HOA Trap right now, hit that like button. It's free, takes 1 second, and it helps this story reach more folks who know what it's like to deal with HOA nightmares. Now, back to the story. Deborah Finch received the letter on Monday morning, and you could have seen the color drain from her face if you'd been standing in her office when the certified mail clerk handed it to her. She opened it, and she read it, and at first she didn't understand what it meant. So she read it again, and then she understood, and then she panicked. She called her lawyer in Nashville, the one she'd hired to handle the HOA enforcement, and she read him the letter, and he went quiet on the other end of the phone, and then he said, "Deborah, you have a significant problem." And she said, "What do you mean? Can he really close the road?" And he said, "Yes, if he owns it. If the deed is real, then he absolutely can restrict access." She called an emergency meeting of the HOA board. 7 people showed up in that little office at the entrance to Meadow Creek Estates, and she showed them the letter, and she explained what it meant. And the HOA board members looked at each other the way people look at each other when they realize they're about to lose something they didn't know they could lose. Everything they'd built, every investment, every house, every plan, all of it depended on Calloway Road. And they'd been fining Earl Calloway for making his own property look like a farm. And then Deborah Finch made a decision that was maybe the biggest mistake of all. She called Sheriff Tom Hadley. Sheriff Hadley had been the sheriff of Monroe County for 21 years. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s, with a crisp brown county sheriff uniform that he kept clean and neat, a gold badge pinned to his chest, and a tan cowboy hat that he wore with the kind of authority that comes from actually knowing what he's doing and caring about the people he's responsible for. He'd lived in Monroe County his whole life, had been born here, had gone to school here, had raised his family here. He knew Earl Calloway. Not well, but well enough. He knew that Earl was a man who didn't cause trouble, who kept to himself, who was respected in the county for working hard and staying honest. So, when Deborah Finch showed up at his office on a Tuesday afternoon, all worked up about this letter from a lawyer, with copies of the deed and the HOA letter and her own violation notices, he was surprised. She showed him the documents and she explained the situation, and she said, "Earl's threatening to close the only road into my subdivision. That's extortion. That's coercion. I need you to force him to stop this immediately." Sheriff Hadley listened to her carefully. He read through the documents, he looked at the deed, and then he said, very carefully, "Ma'am, let me make sure I understand this. The road is private property?" "I don't care if it's private," Deborah said. "He can't threaten to close it. That's illegal. That's extortion." "Actually," Sheriff Hadley said, speaking carefully and thoughtfully, the way he did when he was thinking through something, "if it's his road, he pretty much can do what he wants with it. That's what property means. But let me look into it. Let me drive out and talk to Earl and see what's going on here." He drove out to Earl's farm that afternoon, and he found Earl in the barn, fixing a gate that had gotten bent somehow, working on it with the same patient attention he gave to everything. They stood there in that barn for about 5 minutes without talking, just the two of them, and then Earl said, "I figure you're here about the HOA letter." "I am," the sheriff said. "Is that road really yours?" "It is," Earl said. "Deed from 1937. My grandfather built it. The original deed is at the courthouse. It's registered and recorded. It's public record." "You planning to close it?" Sheriff Hadley asked. "No, sir," Earl said. "I'm not planning to close it, but I wanted to make sure they knew it was mine. I wanted them to understand that their entire subdivision, their whole development, it all depends on my goodwill, and my goodwill comes with boundaries. I don't want to be harassed about what my farm looks like. That's a boundary." The sheriff nodded. He understood. "Mind if I see the deed?" Earl took him inside to the kitchen, and there was Mabel with fresh biscuits just coming out of the oven, and the sheriff and Earl sat down at the table, and they had coffee, and Mabel served them biscuits still warm, and Earl showed him the original deed and the photocopy he'd gotten from the courthouse. The sheriff looked at every page, carefully, reading every word, understanding what it meant. And then he said, "Well, that's clear as day. You're right. It's your road, always has been, and you have every legal right to maintain that boundary." "I don't want to be difficult," Earl said. I just want to work my farm and be left alone." "I know you do," the sheriff said. "That's what I thought." Then Sheriff Hadley drove back into town, and he went to the Meadow Creek Estates subdivision office, and he asked to speak to Deborah Finch. She met him in a little office that smelled like air freshener and ambition, and she said, "Are you going to arrest him?" "No, ma'am," Sheriff Hadley said. His voice was firm and kind at the same time. "Because he hasn't done anything wrong. That road has belonged to the Calloway family since 1937. It's private property, and he has every legal right to restrict access to private property. What he did was nothing illegal. What he did was exercise his property rights. And it sounds to me like you've been harassing him about his own property, threatening him with liens, fining him for things that are on his own land. You need to apologize to Earl Calloway and reverse those fines. Today." Deborah Finch sat down in her chair like something had knocked her over. She'd been expecting support. She'd been expecting the sheriff to force Earl to back down. She'd been expecting to win. "How is this possible?" she asked. "How can we have built an entire subdivision on a road we don't own?" "You can ask the developer that question," the sheriff said. "But the answer is, you didn't check the deed before you built it. And now you're dependent on a man you've been harassing, and that was not a smart move. You should have done your homework. If the HOA Trap has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple bucks a month keeps these stories coming. Links below. Now, back to the story. What happened next? Move fast. The way things move in a small town, when people suddenly understand how much trouble they're actually in. Deborah called an emergency meeting of the HOA board, and she showed them everything. The deed, the letter from Earl's lawyer, the explanation from the sheriff about what private property means and what it allows. She explained the situation in a voice that had lost all of its confidence. The HOA board members looked at the deed. They looked at the map. They realized that every single street in their development, all 43 homes, depended on Calloway Road to exist. Without Calloway Road, they had no access. Without access, their homes were worthless. And they'd been voting to fine a man who could, if he decided to, make all of their property values plummet to zero by simply exercising his property rights. The vote to reverse the fines was unanimous. The vote to apologize to Earl Calloway was unanimous. The vote to dissolve the HOA was almost as quick. Only one board member voted against it, and she didn't say why. The board formally apologized to Earl in a letter that was delivered by certified mail, and they reversed all the fines, and they dissolved the organization that had been harassing him. Deborah Finch offered her resignation as president, and the board accepted it so quickly you could barely see it happen. She'd held the position for exactly 2 years. And then, about 2 months later, a for sale sign went up in front of her house. It stayed there for about 6 months, and then one day it was gone, and Deborah Finch was gone too. She'd found a buyer, apparently, someone from Knoxville who saw the house as a good investment and didn't ask too many questions about the HOA drama. That buyer would wake up one day and realize exactly what Deborah had learned, that you can't control people, you can't control land, and you definitely can't control someone else's private property. Earl didn't change anything. His farm looked the same. The barn was still there, weathered and working. The truck was still there, with its dents and its mud. The woodpile was still there, stacked high and ready for winter. The chickens were still there, doing their chicken things. He didn't gloat. He didn't wave the deed around the neighborhood. He didn't call anybody or send any messages. He didn't go to town and brag about his victory. He just went back to getting up before dawn and making coffee and working his land the way he'd always done. He fixed the fence. He maintained Calloway Road, spreading fresh gravel where it needed it, fixing the drainage, making sure it stayed passable. He lived his life, but something shifted in how people treated him. The neighbors from the subdivision started to acknowledge him when they drove past. They'd wave, they'd slow down and say hi if they saw him working. People started understanding that Earl Calloway wasn't just some old farmer with a farm. He was a man who'd been patient, who'd done his homework, who'd known something important that everybody else had missed. And there was a kind of respect that came with that. The kind of respect that you have for someone who knows their land better than anyone who might try to take it from them. Months passed. Winter came to Monroe County, and it was a hard winter, the kind with ice and snow, and the woodpile got used the way Earl had always known it would be. He split more wood and stacked it, and Mabel used it in the stove, and the farm went about its business. Spring came, and Earl planted his garden, and he worked the soil, and he fixed things that had broken over the winter. Summer came, and he worked, and the heat was thick and heavy the way it gets in Tennessee. Fall came, and he harvested, and he prepared for winter again. Mabel went back to humming her regular hymns, the happy ones, the ones that had melody and joy in them. She stopped worrying in that dark, heavy way. She made biscuits again because it made her happy, not because she was afraid. The screen porch in the evening became a peaceful place again, where Earl and Mabel sat and watched the light change over Monroe County. One evening, late in the fall, long after the subdivision had settled down and found its new normal, long after everyone had accepted what had happened, Earl sat on the porch swing with Mabel, the way they had 1,000 times before, and their grandson was playing in the yard, running around the way kids do, chasing lightning bugs, being 6 years old, being alive. Earl was sipping coffee that he'd brought out from the kitchen, still warm, still strong. Mabel was humming something soft and old, something her mother had taught her. The sun was going down over Monroe County, sliding down behind the trees, the light turning gold, and then orange, and then dark, the way it had every evening since Virgil Calloway first came here, with nothing but a strong back and a clear voice, the way it would every evening for the rest of their lives. "You ever regret how you handled that HOA business?" Mabel asked him. Her voice was quiet, just asking, not pushing. And Earl thought about it, really thought about it, about all of it. Deborah Finch and her clipboard, the violation notices, the fines, the late nights sitting on this very porch worrying, the trip to the courthouse, the letter from the lawyer, all of it. He thought about the fact that he could have handled it differently, could have been angry, could have been mean, could have been vindictive. "No, ma'am," he said finally. "I never did regret it. Sometimes you have to let people understand what they don't want to understand. But I didn't have to be mean about it. I just had to be honest. I just had to stand on what was true. The road was mine, the land was mine, and I had a right to that." That's the story of Earl Calloway and Deborah Finch and Calloway Road. It's a story about land and family and property rights. It's a story about how doing your homework matters, about how you have to check the deeds before you build a subdivision. It's a story about what happens when you mess with a quiet man on his own land. It's a story about how an 87-year-old deed in a courthouse vault turned out to be the most powerful piece of paper in Monroe County. Deborah Finch sold her house to a couple from Knoxville who understood that farms look like farms and didn't expect them to look like subdivision living. The Meadow Creek Estates HOA never was reformed. They just didn't see the point in having one anymore. The subdivision kept on living, 43 homes accessing the outside world by way of Calloway Road. And nobody bothered Earl Calloway anymore. And nobody should have in the first place. Thank you for watching. If this story reminded you that common sense beats a clipboard every time, share it. Subscribe to the HOA Trap for more stories about folks who knew their land better than anyone who tried to take it. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if Deborah Finch showed up at your gate?